Hey everybody, welcome to the Wood Samaritan. I'm Rob. Today I'm coming to you from my kitchen because it's Wednesday, which means it's my wife's shop night, not mine. So I'm inside. Today's video is an interesting one, more of an attempt at an art piece than a typical woodworking project for me. Also getting to use epoxy a little bit more as something I'm experimenting with. So today I'm going to show you how I turn this kind of old junky pallet wood into this end grain epoxy clock. I call it my COVID clock. The idea here behind this project was to make something that represents a little bit of the chaos we've all been experiencing through COVID, hence the chaotic end grain that you'll see, and also the order that's kind of come to pass with the leadership and other things that, especially locally here in BC, we've had around flattening the curve and making things a bit safer for everyone. So I call it my COVID clock. I also figured the X pattern you see on the epoxy is kind of like the X's you see at the store that tell you where to stand for physical distancing. So anyways, here's a video on how I made this clock. I think it turned out pretty well, and I've actually already sold it. So let's get to it. Started out by using the metal detector to make sure there was no nails or staples or other stuff I hadn't thought of in the pallet wood. A quick scrub with the wire brush to get any rocks or dirt that was embedded in it. The stuff was pretty dirty. Then over to the jointer to take a little bit off each surface, get it square and flat, and side benefit is also clean them up quite a bit. Once I got one side clean and square, it was over to the planer, running them through. These things were quite uneven and needed a number of passes through to get them to the point where they were clean and flat on both sides. Next, it was back to the jointer to take one edge and get it square and cleaned up before I could trim down the other side. With that done, it was over to the table saw using the cleaned up edge from the jointer against the fence to rip them down to size and get them square. With that done, it was time to get out the clamps for the first of many glue ups. The first glue up was just straight face grain to face grain. I made sure to put plenty of glue on here to get lots of adhesion between the different planks. As you can see here, good amount of squeeze out. That way I knew there was plenty of glue in there, not leaving any gaps. With that done, it was a matter of leaving it to dry overnight, ensuring everything was ready to go for cutting on the table saw. So next I got out the table saw sled and cut off the end square first, then set my stop block to the width that I wanted and cut the rest of the block into basically 1.5 inch wide strips. For the next glue up, I was going to change it over to an end grain pattern, which meant I needed to run the side of each strip over the jointer so that I'd get a nice clean square face to glue together. Then back to the gluing and clamping, much like the first one, lots of glue, slap them all together, good squeeze out, and give it lots of time to dry. As you can see, After the first end grain glue up, it's starting to look a little more like what I wanted, but it's still a very organized pattern. Next, it was time to start creating some of the chaos pattern. To do this, I took a piece of scrap, cut it at a relatively shallow angle that would support the main block on that angle as I ran it through the table saw and the sled again. So with this, using the stop block, each time I just shifted it over and again ended up with about inch or so wide strips, and it was a matter of cutting up the full block to this dimension. After doing that a couple more times, cutting, gluing, it was time to take the strips and try to arrange them for the final glue up in some sort of pattern that was not a pattern. It's unbelievably hard to arrange things that start as a geometric shape and to get them to look chaotic, despite what you'd think. So after I did a bunch of different testing, aligned it a number of different ways, finally settled on something that was as close to chaos as I figured I was going to get, and did the final glue up. Here you can see there is definitely some element of pattern to it, but there is quite a lot of randomness to it. After letting that dry, I took it over to the CNC and used a just straight cut 3/4 inch wide bit to flatten it off. And cutting it into quarters, I then quickly built up a mold using some spare melamine board I had kicking around. And I ensured to use plenty of DAP on all the seams to make sure none of that liquid epoxy was going to leak out. I also added a few screws from the underneath into each of the four blocks just to make sure it would not rise and float in the epoxy once it was poured. Next, it was time for some math sorcery to figure out how much liquid epoxy volume I would need to fill up the space.
Many hours later,
after figuring out the right volume and the mixing ratio, which is just under 3:1 by volume, I started mixing the resin and the hardener into the mixing cup, and I added 2 different colors of metallic pearl into the epoxy. Wasn't quite the color I wanted, so I added a little more blue and gave it another few minutes of mixing to ensure it was all thoroughly mixed. You don't want to undermix your epoxy. And it was pour time. In it goes. Such a satisfying thing to do is pouring this liquid in and filling up that hole. I made sure to leave a few drips to fill in a couple of small voids that there were in the surface of the wood. Then it was time for my favorite part of epoxy, and using the torch to get rid of all the bubbles. Just love how all those just melt away and turns into a nice glassy surface. Here I'm using a spatula to rub the sides of the wood to make sure any bubbles that were hanging onto the edge of that wood floated to the surface. Then some quick swirls with the spatula to get the metallic pigment to have that shape. Next, over to the CNC, cutting out, while surfacing it back to flat, and also cutting out the round shape of the actual clock. Next, it was the rough sanding. So I went from about 60 grit through to 150. The idea here was to get most of the material I was going to remove off, especially that tough end grain, before doing the final little bit of CNCing to make the 4 white marks at 12, 3, 6, and 9 on the clock face. I also added a small round over to each edge just to soften the corners. I laid out the 4 hour markers for 12, 3, 6, and 9, and then used a 1/8 inch CNC bit to cut it out. Once I was done, I poured a little bit of white epoxy into each and let that dry. Next, it was on to the final sand. After getting all the epoxy sanded smooth, did a bit of hand sanding, and then went on to apply the Cody's oil, which is a great finish for pretty much anything, in my opinion. But I find it works really well for wood and epoxy blended together. Here I'm applying it with a 2500 grit scuff pad, which I found works quite well at smoothing especially smoothing the joints between where the epoxy and the wood meet up while applying the finish. With that done, I let the Odie's dry for about 45 minutes and then gave it a quick buff with a cotton terry cloth on the drill. A little more hand buffing, and then it was going to be on to assembling the clock mechanism. It's nothing fancy, it's just one I ordered off Amazon, quite simple to put together. Just had to drill the recess and the hole through for the spindle, I guess it's called, and then you just tighten up the one nut, and the rest of the bits pretty much just press on, throw a battery in, and you've got a clock. Overall, I was really happy with how this came out. I really liked the swirl, metallic swirl that came out in the epoxy, and pretty proud of this as a first clock I've ever made. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate you leaving a like, and if you want to see more, please go ahead and subscribe and click that bell button to get notifications whenever I post something new. Other than that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.